Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored Radio Show on Pacifica Radio. I am your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield, along with Mickey Huff. And we are very glad to welcome back onto the program Leonardo Flores, who's the co-founder of the Venezuela Solidarity Network. He previously worked as an organizer with Code Pink and as an analyst with the Venezuelan embassy in the U.S. Leonardo was born in Venezuela and maintains close ties to social movements that have transformed the country over the past 26 years. Leonardo, thank you so much for joining us again.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. I'm really happy to be back.
Yeah, we're happy to have you, as long as it's still legal for us to be talking in this land of the free. So we are recording this on Tuesday, August 26th, for those who are wondering, because this will air the following Monday. And last week, U.S. President Trump ordered 3 warships and thousands of Marines to station themselves off the coast of Venezuela, a clear and extreme escalation of what was already a pretty tense relationship. And Leah, we've had you on the show before to discuss that. This also comes after a January executive order designating drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations and authorizing military force to combat them. Oddly absent from that list are the likes of the Sackler family, who made billions from knowingly killing hundreds of thousands of people in the U.S. vis-a-vis the opioid epidemic. But that small oversight aside, this is not the first time that the U.S. has used drug trafficking as a pretense to try and destabilize and indeed overthrow Venezuela's government. Could you talk a little bit about that specific tactic?
About the drug trafficking? Yeah. I mean, I think this is part of a narrative that goes back over 20 years now of trying to tie Venezuela, not just to drug trafficking, but to terror. They're saying that Venezuela has ties to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to Iran, to any sort of quote unquote malignant actor in the hemisphere. And really, when you look at the statistics, the data, the argument from the United States just totally falls apart, because Venezuela happens to be a country that produces zero cocaine. It grows zero coca leaves, and it's somehow now being blamed for this spread of cocaine throughout the hemisphere, and it's totally ridiculous. So I was actually just looking at the drug enforcement, the DEA's National Drug Threat Assessment Report, the latest one from 2025. And it mentions Venezuela in exactly 2 paragraphs. It doesn't mention at all the so-called Cartel de los Soles, which is this fictional cartel that is allegedly that President Maduro is the head of. And what it does say is that, that this criminal organization called the Tren de Aragua, which we heard a lot about this year because that was being used to criminalize Venezuelan migrants in the United States. And that's it. There's only a brief mention. It doesn't say, and it's what caught my eye more than the fact that of what wasn't in this report is another thing not in this report is that the specific data about cocaine flows through South America, because they used to publish this map every year that showed that the bulk of cocaine flows through the Pacific. And then a little bit flows through the Caribbean. Part of it flows through what the U.S. calls the Western Caribbean. This is a distinction only really the United States makes, which is the part of the Caribbean controlled by Colombia in South America, and the rest through the so-called Eastern Caribbean. And when I was looking at the latest statistics from the UN, this map shows that 87% of the cocaine that's produced in South America goes through the Pacific. 8% goes through the Western Caribbean, which is basically Colombia. Colombia is part of the Caribbean. And a mere 5% flows through Venezuela. And of that 5%, Venezuela seizes about half of that. So they seized last year 52 tons of cocaine. And the estimated traffic of cocaine through Venezuela last year was something like 110 tons. So they got nearly half. So this idea that somehow Venezuela is behind some nefarious plot to sow the streets of the United States with cocaine is pure nonsense. And what it really points to is this kind of this plan by the far right in Florida, led by now Secretary of State Marco Rubio, to demonize Venezuela and to set the stage for a possible military invasion. And they threaten that again, as you mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even if there were drug trafficking going through Venezuela at a higher rate than what you mentioned, the way to deal with that, firstly, is to address drug addiction as a health problem, not a criminal problem. And going back to Ehrlichman in the 80s, drugs have always been useful to the ruling elite in the United States. Ehrlichman said that we know that we couldn't make it illegal to be anti-war in Black, so we went after the drugs that were popular in those communities, namely crack and weed. And so drugs have been very useful for U.S. empire, and this just shows another example of that. This is a useful cover story to really go after Venezuela for just simply being anti-U.S. imperialism. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the sovereignty that doesn't just touch on Venezuela, but also there's an entire area designated as the Zone of Peace. And this is a designation made back in 2014 by the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, which calls for peaceful resolution of disputes and the rejection of force in regional affairs in this area where these warships are now stationed. Leo, could you talk a little bit about this designation and also this Community of Latin American and Caribbean States and how they have come together against U.S. imperialist violence?
Yeah, so the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States is called the CELAC for short, and it's basically an attempt to form a multilateral organization that isn't dependent on the U.S. So it's almost like a type of alternative to the Organization of American States, the OAS, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C., and which is really kind of the number one place for plotting out coups and plotting out interventions in Latin America from the United States. So when CELAC declares this zone of peace in 2014, as you mentioned, it's really interesting because, first of all, Latin America, basically anything from Mexico on down, this is the region of the world that's arguably the most peaceful region of the world. We haven't had a major military conflict there in many, many years, except for U.S. interventions, of course. Conflicts are usually, the ones that do exist are usually limited to being civil wars. That we saw that especially in the 80s with the dirty wars, and of course the ongoing civil conflict in Colombia that's been ending. And so this idea that you now have to patrol this whole entire region because it's somehow a threat to the United States is ludicrous on its face. And part of the reasoning that this is happening is because Southcom, which is the U.S. Southern Command, has to justify its own budget, has to justify its own existence. So then we have the Pentagon playing into the alarmist ravings of far-right Republican politicians and then kind of backing them so that they can ensure that they still get their slice of the pie when it comes to the military budget allocation, and so that the Southcom generals can live their very rich and easy lives without having to do anything, because they don't have to do anything. Obviously, they shouldn't be doing anything anywhere in the world, but particularly in Latin America, which is already kind of a zone of peace because there isn't that international conflict that we see elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is very reminiscent of what the U.S. has done in the so-called Middle East, right? We have to create these terrorist organizations so we have a reason to fight them. And it seems like the same thing here. And of course, there's the added layer because since the advent of the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. has considered all of Latin America to be its backyard, right? And of course, never supported any kind of revolutions for independence because the United States did not want them to be independent. That would threaten the U.S. hegemony in the region. And I wanted to sort of get into what's going on the ground in Venezuela with regards to this escalation by the United States. Vladimir Pedrino Lopez, Venezuela's defense minister, said last week that, quote, military enlistment means rejecting U.S. imperialism and aggression because national sovereignty is what matters. No to imperialism, no to military aggression, no to the imperialist vulgarity of the U.S. against the people of Venezuela, end quote. And I just can't, I can't imagine a defense minister in the United States saying no to military aggression. It's just so absurd that I can't help but chuckle. But can you talk a little bit about what the feeling is on the ground in Venezuela right now with regards to what the defense minister is talking about and with regards to people signing up to enlist in the military?
Yeah, so when he's talking about enlistment, he's not actually talking about the military per se. He's talking about Venezuela's militias. So Venezuela's had a system of militias for about 20 years now that basically finds a way for communities to take part in the defense of the nation. The Venezuelan government puts a strong emphasis on what it calls the civil military union. And so it wants to not just subordinate the military to the president and to civilian command, but also to incorporate civilians in the defense of the country in really meaningful ways. And so last weekend in Venezuela, they had this basically this inscription drive to sign up for the militias in response to the threat of a U.S. invasion, because people in Venezuela know exactly what the U.S. wants for them, right? They know that the US is trying to bring a civil war into Venezuela, and they reject it widely. And so Venezuela's militia, at the last count that I saw, has now 5 million people in it. And it's an astounding number. And I'm not even talking about the professional armed forces, which are probably a number in the hundreds of thousands. But 5 million people is a huge number. And the militia gets widely mocked in Washington, D.C. Beltway insider circles because, oh, these people aren't serious. But even if just, 10% of those 5 million show up to the call, that's still more than the number of troops that Donald Trump is claiming to be sending to Venezuela's coast right now. And on top of that, we've seen these militias in action. I don't know if you remember in 2020, there was the so-called Operation Gideon, which is the mercenary invasion, quote unquote, invasion of Venezuela, where you had this guy named Jordan Goudreau who signed a contract, so he says, with Juan Guaido, the so-called interim president, the puppet president, where he would be invading Venezuela with a group of mercenaries, and he basically would have had carte blanche to kill. It would have been a license to kill any Venezuelan that they perceived to be a part of the government or supporting the government. It would have, reminiscent of the dirty wars in Central America that I mentioned earlier. It was a totally disgusting document. When these guys invaded, they were caught by a group of fishermen. And these fishermen were part of the militia. So when I say about these militias, these are serious. They're serious people who don't want any sort of foreign military presence in Venezuela and are ready and willing to fight for that. And I think really what the Trump administration is doing with those threats is that they're really making the Venezuelan revolution and the sympathizers for the revolution a more cohesive unit, because they really understand what this threat means, that this threat isn't just about socialism, it's about killing the people who are organizing for socialism.
Yeah, and I want to get to the deep understanding of U.S. propaganda and imperialism in a minute, but I also want to, remind listeners in case you don't know, which I believe many do, that the U.S. was also not supposed to have a standing military. It was supposed to have militias, and in fact, and say what you will about the so-called revolution that ousted the British, there's a lot of issues with it, and of course the advent of the United States. But it was done by militias, right? Who went up against what was at the time the strongest military in the world. So this idea that militias can't do it, it's like your own history speaks to the opposite of that. And Leo, you mentioned Juan Guaido, and we're not going to go through the whole spiel. Of course, folks can check out more about that if you want to, including our conversations with Leo from the past. But I'm wondering if I'd like to hear your opinion on this, because the attempt, of course, was to put Juan Guaido as this interim president, which didn't work because everyone in Venezuela was like, who's this guy? And I'm wondering if you feel that what we're seeing now is because the U.S. realized, oh, well, that didn't work out. Just putting in a puppet didn't quite work out. So now we have to escalate it in this way. Do you think that there's a connection there?
Yes and no. So what's going on within the Trump administration right now is really interesting, because there's a really deep division in terms of what to do with Venezuela. On the one hand, you have the neocons led by Secretary of State Rubio. And we have to remember that Rubio, when he was in the Senate during the first Trump administration, he was the architect of Trump's Latin America policy during those first 4 years. So he's the one that insisted on maximum pressure, not just against Venezuela, but against Cuba. He's the one that insisted on pushing for military threats on Juan Guaido, on all the increasing sanctions that killed 40,000 people in their first year alone. And so this guy is leading the charge within the Trump administration for an invasion or intervention of Venezuela, regime change, basically. On the other side, you have kind of the more MAGA isolationist types that don't want to see an invasion of Venezuela or anything, instability in Venezuela rather, because they see it as kind of a gift to China. So it's not as though they're pushing for better relations with Venezuela out of the goodness of their hearts, but it's that they're framing it as sort of an anti-China maneuver to make sure that U.S. companies have a foothold on Venezuelan oil rather than just give it all away to China. And they're being led by Richard Grenell, who's the Trump special envoy to Venezuela, among many other roles this really nasty guy has. So within that division, it's curious because just a couple of weeks ago, before these threats of military invasion, the United States granted a license basically to the Chevron oil company to operate in Venezuela. And so this was kind of a direct blow, not just to Marco Rubio, but to the members of the Florida congressional delegation, for them, this had been a sticking point for them, especially in terms of, they had threatened to vote against Trump's so-called Big Beautiful Bill if the Chevron license went through, and it eventually went through anyway after the bill was passed. In addition to this Chevron license, there was an exchange of people, and a really important exchange of people. We had the 256 Venezuelans who were being held in the torture prison called Secot in El Salvador, and they were finally freed and sent back to Venezuela. You also had at least 7 Venezuelan children who were separated from their families and held in foster care here in the United States, were finally reunited with their families in Venezuela. I think there's still at least 26 or 27 Venezuelan children who are in the same state. So I'm part of the Venezuela Solidarity Network, and one of the things we're trying to do is to bring more attention to the cause of these children who've been split from their families because of Trump's horrible migration policies. And then on the other flip side, in exchange for all of these people being freed and reunited with their families, you had 10 U.S. and U.S. Venezuela dual citizens who were released from prison in Venezuela. They were called so-called political prisoners, but let me just tell you, one of these people, the Venezuelan American, he was wanted for murder in Spain, and Venezuela doesn't extradite its own citizens. So instead, he was charged in Venezuela for this murder in Spain. He was found guilty, and then he was let go to the United States. So what Trump basically did is that he imported a murderer from Venezuela to the United States as part of this deal, which goes against his entire rhetoric, of course. So that split, right, within the Trump administration, that license and those negotiations were seen really as 2 steps forward. And then my perspective is that the threat of military invasion and then the increase of the bounty on President Maduro and this new kind of rhetoric is a way for not just for Marco Rubio to save face, which it is, but also a way for him to kind of set the stage, not for about military intervention in Venezuela right now, but perhaps 4 years from now when he's either in the White House as president or vice president. As we know, that those are his ambitions. So he's kind of playing this long-term game of maintaining the pressure on Venezuela with the hopes that eventually, the political situation, the powers that be in the United States will look upon an intervention favorably. I don't think they do that right now because they know that A, it's not going to be as easy as anyone says, and B, it's going to just rile oil markets at a time when they're already a bit riled up, especially because of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to ask you about China as well, because I know that Venezuela and China have been, their relations have been getting closer and better, not just because the U.S. is belligerent. But I wanted to ask, what do you feel China's role would be in such a time that there would be a military invasion of Venezuela? Do you think that China would come to any kind of material aid to Venezuela at that time?
Yeah, that's really hard to say because I don't know that China wants to get involved in any sort of military conflict with the United States at this point. They did issue a very strong response to these threats, and they said that Venezuela deserves its sovereignty and that all of Latin America deserves its sovereignty without threats of military intervention from the United States. I don't know that they would supply any sort of material aid. I think they would certainly supply humanitarian aid to Venezuela. I don't know if they would supply military aid. I don't think it would get to that point, at least not now. Maybe in a few years from now, the scenario might change. But to me, it's also interesting just to draw it out a little bit further because we saw an immediate rejection of these plans for military intervention by Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, who not only said that he denies or he rejects this intervention, but he also denied the very existence of the Cartel de los Soles. And he said that the people who control the cocaine trade are very well known, not just to Colombian authorities, but to U.S. and to EU authorities with whom Colombia has been sharing intelligence. And to try to blame it on Venezuela is completely kind of, it's a ridiculous idea because they know who the drug traffickers are and they know how they're being financed. And yet the U.S. doesn't want to do anything about it because it really can't. And as you were mentioning earlier, I just wanted to point out that when the U.S., heavily invested in the so-called drug war in Colombia with Plan Colombia in the 1990s, and then again with Plan Mexico in the 2000s, really what it did was it strengthened cartels like you wouldn't believe. And so it totally backfired. And I fear that the United States is going to do something that's going to totally backfire once again in that regard.
Yeah, and of course, it's just a list of priorities, right? I mean, during Prohibition, that really created and bolstered the mafia. So it's like the U.S. does not have a problem with organized crime, whether that be for the so-called mob or cartels or what have you. Indeed, it's a way of creating the folk devils so that you have something to fight. And the idea that the largest surveillance network in the world, the United States, wouldn't know, especially someone like Maduro, if a sitting president were part of it. I mean, it's just so absurd. And this is what I want to get to now because if you understand propaganda and you understand, critical media literacy, how to see when you're being lied to, just the idea that Maduro could be the head of our cartel is like, it's like the kind of stuff I would expect to see on, Comedy Central or something. Like it is satire in its purest form. And yet so many people in the United States fall for it. And yet the target audience for the United States in these color revolutions, these kind of moves, is the people of that country. So the US is really wanting to for the people of Venezuela to be like, yeah, Maduro bad, US good. But it's not working, and it hasn't worked, just like it hasn't worked in Cuba, Iran, etc. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the media works in Venezuela and how people understand the propaganda of the US empire, and why aren't they falling for our really, really intense propaganda, Leo?
Yeah. So one of the first things that Chavez realized when he won elections in 1998 and came into office in 1999 was that the whole media was against him, not just throughout his campaign in 98, but then through every sort of reform he tried to push. He faced this really intense backlash from traditional media in Venezuela, which looked at the time very much like traditional media in the United States, controlled by, a few oligarchical families and mega corporations, right? And so Venezuela took really important steps to counter that media narrative. The first thing they did was they started funding community media very widely. And so you saw all sorts of community radio stations and newspapers, and now it's, more podcasts and influencers, but the same sort of thing happens where there's a really healthy ecosystem for independent media in Venezuela to operate. And that really helps counter the propaganda that we get from the United States. The second thing he did was he founded Telesur, which is really one of the most important sources of news for Latin America that there is. And it's a multinational effort. And Telesur has been really key in kind of debunking some of these wild accusations and claims that are made, not just against President Maduro, but against Venezuela as a whole. And so when we see that Venezuelans, by and large, are not falling for US propaganda, it's because they have alternative sources of media. And because they understand that the traditional and corporate sources of media that have been feeding them lies for, their entire lives are not to be trusted, right? And then on top of that, let me just mention briefly that people in Venezuela know that the one person who's had his picture taken with members of drug cartels is Juan Guaido. When in 2019, Juan Guaido travels to Colombia for some sort of conference. And a couple of days after he traveled there, pictures are leaked of him standing with two leaders of a cartel known as Los Pastrojos, which operates in eastern Colombia and which smuggled him across the border between Venezuela and Colombia. And so, if anyone's a drug trafficker, it's going to be the dude who's taking pictures with drug traffickers, right? And so the Venezuelan people kind of understand this. And then you also know it's totally ludicrous, right? If you have access to the world's largest reserves of oil, which Venezuela does, why would you engage in something like cocaine trafficking, right? Like if you wanted to be corrupt and dirty, it wouldn't make any sense to engage in something that's globally condemned and when you have access to all this oil. So on the face of it, these arguments kind of fall flat, and the Venezuelan people are onto that.
And I'm also curious, I mean, because Juan Guaido was a member of an opposition party. So where's the status of that opposition party? And is it still kind of, puppeteered by the United States, or has that also fallen apart? Because as you pointed out, it's just the whole thing is ludicrous.
Yeah, so that party has fractured a little bit, but they're still receiving a lot of US support. So basically, the United States has been playing besides what we've already talked about, they've been playing a pretty awful role in Venezuelan internal politics, because for the last 26 years, they've been funding the extreme right. And I don't exaggerate when I say it's the fascist opposition. There's other groups on the right, other politicians on the right in Venezuela that are more moderate, that I wouldn't call fascist. They might be neoliberal or neocon or just conservative. But these fascists have been supported by the United States. And by supporter, I mean they've received funding from USAID, NED, all of these kind of slush funds, basically, that give money out to far right actors throughout the world, particularly in Venezuela. So right now, Juan Guaido's party Juan Guaido is pretty much sidelined, but another person who's taken over the mantle is Maria Corina Machado. She is the one really pushing this idea that Venezuela is this narco state that has to be destroyed because it's really harming the national security of the United States. And nobody believes that anymore, right? I mean, I think there's a recent poll in Venezuela, and I'm trying to just find real quick the figures. A recent poll in Venezuela showed that, that 81%, that 82% of the country agrees that Venezuela is sovereign and no government can threaten the republic. So that's 82% of people who really support Venezuela's sovereignty. That 82% figure is more than any political party has ever won. So it's a figure that we could, say it's bipartisan to kind of put it in terms of the United States. And on top of that, we see poll after poll rejecting sanctions, rejecting intervention, people wanting peace and stability, and the far right is offering the exact opposite.
Yeah, and just wrapping up here, I wanted to ask, because there are still sanctions against Venezuela. There's still this economic warfare, which we talked about on an earlier episode, that the Lancet Medical Journal came out with a report that U.S. sanctions alone, these unilateral economic measures, as they're really called because they're not sanctions, they kill more than 500,000 people a year. And of course, people in Venezuela are a part of that horrific number. And so I'm curious, just with the few minutes that we have left here, could you talk a little bit about the economic ways that Venezuela is, along with folks like the other BRICS nations, are sidestepping U.S. economic hegemony, not just this military imperialist violence?
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned it, right? This new Lancet report, 560,000 people killed by sanctions globally every year. That's more than are killed in traditional military conflicts. And Venezuela is not just seeing an economic war, but also a hybrid war against it, right? And in terms of the economic war, Venezuela has really been able to turn the page. It hit rock bottom in roughly 2020, and then the economy's been growing for 4 straight years since 2021. And part of that growth is based on the fact that Venezuela it went from importing over 80% of its food to now producing internally 98%. So that's been a dramatic shift in how Venezuela has been able to achieve food sovereignty in a very short amount of time. And behind that growth in food production has been Venezuela's system of communes, who've played a really leading role in helping Venezuela overcome the worst of the sanctions. There's still a lot more to be done in terms of economic growth, especially, repairing the health sector, repairing the education sector. But the United States makes it more and more difficult. Despite the fact that there's a Chevron license, the U.S. really is still putting its boot on the neck of the Venezuelan economy. And despite that, because also, not just because of what's happening internally in Venezuela, but because of Venezuela's South-South relations, say, with China, Iran, Russia, Brazil, Colombia, other countries, Venezuela has been able to find ways to overcome those sanctions and to boost its national production. And then in terms of oil production, it's really unfortunate but one of the things that sanctions does is that it really kind of makes it impossible to have transparency over the oil sector, because basically ships have to turn their transponders off in order to go to Venezuela and take on oil. Otherwise, the United States will know immediately which companies are violating these sanctions. So a lot of kind of undercover things happen to ensure that Venezuela's oil can reach global markets. And because of this, Venezuela takes a massive discount on oil sales. So if the sanctions ended tomorrow, we would see a huge boost to the Venezuelan economy. But nonetheless, even if they continue, I think Venezuela is going to continue to grow steadily, although, much too slowly for what we need to see in terms of really helping the Venezuelan people overcome all of these economic issues they're facing.
Yeah, of course. And just as we covered in a previous show, even if you didn't care about the Venezuelan people, which you should, but even if you only cared about people in the U.S., these quote unquote sanctions, these economic measures hurt people in the U.S. as well, just like tariffs hurt people in the U.S. This idea that you can isolate is it's such a tired and provably false argument. So even if you just cared about people in the U.S., this kind of escalation, whether that be economic or indeed military, is just bad. It's bad for everybody involved, and that includes people in the U.S. So, Leo, could you tell people where, I know that you mentioned the Venezuela Solidarity Network, where can people find out more about that and the work that you do?
Yeah, so you go to www.venezuelasolidaritynetwork.org. And there you'll see a mailing list that you can join. We have monthly webinars. These webinars often feature grassroots voices from Venezuela. And it's a really great way to kind of break what they call the media blockade, because it's really hard to get news out of Venezuela, right? And this is one of the ways that we can get news, is to talk to people directly in Venezuela. And that's one of the things that the VSN, the Venezuela Solidarity Network, aims to provide.
That's fantastic. Well, as a critical media literacy org, we love that. And we love the grassroots media is so vital. In fact, you can't have the truth without it, as our previous guest, Dr. Ramsey Baroud, pointed out. So, Leo, thank you so much for coming on the show and contextualizing and tearing away the propaganda lens from this issue. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Anytime.